Ladies and gentlemen, please come to order. It's my great privilege now to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this morning, the Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable Ray Mabus. Before his appointment, Secretary Mabus served in a variety of leadership positions vital to our nation, including the Governor of the Magnolia State, Mississippi, Ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Chairman and CEO of a manufacturing company in the industrial base. Included in his many duties as the 75th United States Secretary of the Navy is the oversight of the construction and repair of naval ships, aircraft, and facilities. He's responsible for an annual budget in excess of $160 billion and his leadership of almost 900,000 people. Secretary Mabus, however, looks at the most important element of our service and gives focus to improving the quality of life of the sailors and Marines and their families. He has also directed the Navy and Marine Corps to change the way they use, produce, and acquire energy, setting aggressive goals that will move the Navy and Marine Corps to use at least 50% alternative energy no later than 2020. Secretary Mabus has improved the acquisition process within the department and has stressed Navy and Marine Corps leadership in development of unmanned systems. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the Honorable Ray Mabus.
Glenn, thank you so much, and thank y'all all for allowing me to be here today. This group and the people here and the people that you represent are really incredibly, vitally important to the Navy and to the nation. One of the partnerships and the teamworks that we have between our Navy uniformed service, our Navy civilians, those in industry, and maybe the most important partnership, that with the American people. And I was thinking on the way over here, I'm an English major. My dad was an engineer, class of 1922 at Ole Miss. It was one of the, I won't say biggest disappointments of his life, but when I was getting ready to go away to college, we were looking through the catalog. That was way before online things, and so we were flipping through the catalog, and he was recommending courses that I take, and they were all math and science and engineering. I kept turning to the political science, English, history courses, and I think he was very proud of me, but I also think he worried about my ability to get a job when I finished Ole Miss. And you know, I may have proven him correct in some ways, in that in May I will have been Secretary of the Navy for 5 years. It's the longest I've ever held a job. And I hope I keep going on that string for a while. But organizations like yours play an absolutely central role in supporting our fleet and helping to develop our professionals to meet the needs of the Navy and the nation. And you know, one of the things I just want to say here, and last September, we had just a devastating tragedy at the Washington Navy Yard. We lost 12 people, NAVC and NAVSUP, all civilians. And some of the things that it showed was the close partnership and how we literally wouldn't have a fleet without the engineers and the other Navy civilians that design and procure and build these ships. And the other thing was, I went to the Navy Yard. I went that day, but I went back 2 days later, and virtually everybody was back at work. And they were back at work because what they did was so crucial, because of their dedication, because of their patriotism, because of their willingness to overcome horrific events in the service of this country. So let me talk for a while about my perspective about American sea power, what it means and how the platforms and systems that you design and build, the work that you do every day, will help define our ability to respond to our nation's call in the future. You know, sometimes it's easy, and I know this from personal experience, to get drawn into the project of the day. Try to keep the alligators that are closest to the P-row away from you. But it's important to every now and again look at the big picture. Why are we doing this? What's the reason for it? Why do we need a fleet? Why do we need to be forward deployed in a global Navy? More than 2 centuries ago, when our nation was established, founding fathers knew of the importance of a Navy and Marine Corps. In the Constitution, they put the responsibility on Congress to provide for and maintain a Navy. Now, that second part, I think, is particularly important, and it bears repeating. Maintain a Navy. They knew that a naval force was important not just in times of war, but also in times of peace. Those founding fathers recognized that having Navy and Marine Corps to sail the world's oceans was vital to protecting our commerce and to protecting our nation's interests, regardless of whether in peacetime or wartime. Having that global presence 200 years ago was a sign that America was a player on the world stage. And as you well know, we call that presence. Presence is what we do. Presence is what the Navy and Marine Corps uniquely give to the country. Presence is what we're all about. We've always been there when the nation called, from those great frigate duels in the War of 1812, 200 years ago. And while we have a very close working relationship with our British colleagues, the First Sea Lord, when he visits my office, always makes note of the fact that all the art contains burning British ships. And I point out that that's exactly correct. From those days to the ironclads of the Civil War, to the Battle of the Atlantic in World War I, to the great battles of the Pacific, to the rivers of Southeast Asia, to our worldwide operations today, the Navy, Marine Corps have always been ready to fight and to win our nation's wars from and on the sea. But we do a whole lot more than that. We've also been there to provide the President options. From the Africa Squadron sailing against the slave trade in the 1850s to the Great White Fleet going around the world more than 100 years ago, to the quarantine during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Our presence ensures that our leaders have alternatives. Our presence can deter, it can reassure, and it can provide the crucial backing that's needed to sometimes make diplomacy work. And our global presence always has a purpose. The Navy and Marine Corps are there to deal with the unexpected, to deal with whatever happens to come over the horizon. They're there to face the dangers of an emergent threat and any new crisis, foreseen or unforeseen. Our naval presence around the world allows us to keep America safe and our interests secure. We've had a lot of examples in recent years, just a few of them, when North Korea threatens and does launch missiles from time to time. Our ballistic missile defense ships are already there, working in concert with our allies. There's no escalation. We're there. Just a few months ago, when our friends in the Philippines had that devastating typhoon Haiyan hit them, we had Marines there in just a few hours. And within a couple of days, we had a dozen Navy ships off the coast. So before day one, in any crisis, the Navy and Marine Corps are ready. We're already forward deployed, already trained, already there, ready for orders. It's what makes the Navy and Marine Corps very different. We don't have to mobilize. We aren't dependent on basing rights or overflight permission, and we don't take up an inch of anybody else's soil. Before the bell rings and long after the guns fall silent, presence means we are where it counts, not just at the right time, but all the time. As Secretary of the Navy, it's my job to ensure that we recruit, train, and equip the Navy and Marine Corps so that they can provide and maintain that presence. I've focused on 4 key factors: people, platforms, power, and partnerships, because taken together, they give you that 5th P, presence, and they all matter. Now, every one of these requires a lot of in-depth look and analysis and discussion to make sure that we're accomplishing what we need to for the American people. And we've worked through recent budget issues, fiscal planning. We've kept those as our benchmark. Today I'm going to talk about one of them because of this group, and that's platforms. From the days of the first 6 frigates to the ships that we're designing and building today. And by the way, since I didn't study engineering but did take a couple of history courses, first Secretary of the Navy, and I'm the 75th, Benjamin Stoddert, had no ships when he became Secretary of the Navy. He was the one that commissioned those first 6 frigates to be built. And evidently, Mr. Stoddert was a fairly good politician as well. He built those 6 frigates in 6 different states. So from those days to today, it's our responsibility that we give our sailors and Marines and platforms that they need to be successful. Those ships, those subs, those aircraft, that's what gives us that presence and the sailors that operate them. We have the most advanced platforms in the world. But at some point, quantity becomes a quality all its own. And if you've heard me speak before, I apologize, but I keep repeating some numbers. On 9/11/2001, the U.S. Navy had 316 ships. By 2008, after one of the great military buildups in American history, we were down to 278 ships and falling. In the 4 years immediately before I became secretary, the U.S. Navy put 19 ships under contract. That's not enough to halt the slide in the size of the fleet, not enough to keep up the industrial base either. In the first 4 years that I was secretary, and I am really proud of this number, we have put 60 ships under contract. And that's with a smaller Department of the Navy top-line budget. Before the end of this decade, under our current plans, we will have the fleet back at 300 ships. And we've done it using some sort of basic things. Things like fixed price contracts and block buys and multi-years. And frankly, sometimes driving a harder bargain for taxpayers. I've told one story about my dad. I'm going to tell another one. My father was probably the cheapest human that has ever lived on this earth. And he thought that was a compliment to be called cheap. When I was running for my very first office, state auditor of Mississippi, I was campaigning in Wiggins, Mississippi, walking down the street, shaking hands and asking for people's help. I ran into this gentleman and he said, "Are you Raymond Mabus' son from Ackerman?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And he said, "Well, I'm going to vote for you." And he said, "If you're half as cheap with the state's money as your daddy is with his, we'll be fine." And so when in these negotiations, I am my father's son. We've been also, though, paying attention to things like life cycle cost and automation and modularity to make sure that the ships we're building today, number one, complete their expected 35, 40-year or more lifespan, that they remain cutting edge and relevant during that entire lifespan, and that they remain affordable during that whole lifespan. Last month I went to San Diego and Mobile to visit the shipyards at NASCO and Austal. And platforms that those two shipyards are building are pretty good examples of our shared determination to increase efficiency, improve construction, and reduce cost. At NASCO, they're building ships which are going to be the foundation of our global fleet, our auxiliary and supply ships. And they're also building some new and innovative ships, things like the mobile landing platform and its follow-on, the afloat forward staging base. Those ships and the joint high-speed vessel that's being built at Austal are helping put modularity into the fleet, but it's also helping change the way we operate, change what we can do, allow us to be a lot more creative, allow us to come up with some new and innovative con-ops for the future. And sometimes these ships don't look like traditional Navy ships, and sometimes they don't operate like traditional Navy ships. But one thing we have always done is innovate. One thing we have always done is come up with different operating concepts. One thing we have always done is look to the future. And I'll give you a very quick personal example. 45 years ago, I served on a light guided missile cruiser, USS Little Rock. Built toward the end of World War II, air defense cruiser, and it basically became obsolete, was mothballed. And then when the missile age dawned, we needed missile defense, and so they pulled the Little Rock out of mothballs. Spent several years in a shipyard and millions of dollars to install some new weapons and new systems to do that. And the ship stayed around for another 16 years, including some years in the late 60s and early 70s when Lieutenant J.G. Mabus was on it. And she deployed from time to time in the Med and the North Atlantic, and even as a Sixth Fleet flagship. But what modularity will allow us to do is to change the technology, change the weapon system, change what we do quicker, cheaper, and more in real time. So I served on the CLG-4 USS Little Rock. LCS-9, the next USS Little Rock, being built today, Marinette, Wisconsin, is going to be able to have, instead of the 2 lives that the first USS Little Rock had, 4, 5, 6 different lives during its service in the fleet and to the nation. By the way, one of the really cool things I get to do, I get to name all the Navy ships. Pure coincidence that there's another Little Rock. And that comes all the way back around. Why what you do, designing our ships, coming up with new and innovative, not only designs, but ways of doing business. Shipbuilding and aerospace, the things that you do are unique skills. They require a lot of talent, a lot of training, and a lot of innovative thinking. We have to have in America a vibrant maritime industry for the jobs it creates, for the economic impact it has, but also for the Navy it gives us, for the capabilities and capacities it provides to this country. Everybody in this nation, whether they know it or not, benefits from what you do. More than 90% of the world's commerce travels by sea. More than 95% of the world's telecommunications go under the sea. So regardless of whether people understand or appreciate or even know what the fleet, what the sailors and Marines do for them in keeping those sea lanes open, in making sure that the economies of the world can operate, and making sure that that trade continues for everybody involved in peaceful trade, not just for us. They benefit, and the work that you do touches every single American. Now I'm going to say a couple of words about process. In the last 2 years, some of this has been at risk because we just lacked a flexible, strategically guided approach to spending cuts on defense. The lack of passing a budget on time, and so you go into continuing resolutions. Congress hadn't passed a budget on time since 2005. Now, continuing resolutions sound fine. Yeah, just spend what you spent last year. They are very harmful to the Navy and to the Marine Corps. For example, you cannot put a ship into the shipyard under a continuing resolution because that's a new start. If you are building a ship or repairing a ship and you begin to spend more money than you would have spent the year before, because that happens from time to time as workload increases, you have to stop. You can't spend more. So it hasn't allowed us to do a whole lot of planning. And it hasn't allowed us to set the priorities. The same thing with sequester. And I've said this before, but sequester is just a dumb way to cut. Now, the American people have the right to think and believe and to actually have it happen that we're going to spend less on defense coming after 2 long land wars. But we ought to do it smartly. We ought not to just do it across the board. We ought to do it based on strategy. We ought to do it based on priorities. And the bipartisan budget agreement is a very good, very positive step forward. And it will help us, at least this year and through next year. It provides us some stability, not only for planning in the Pentagon, but also for the industrial base. And that's important. We need to provide some of that stability, some of that transparency. What are we going to build? When are we going to build it? So that industry can make the investments in infrastructure, so that industry can make the investments in training, and so that every ship of the same class and every ship that we don't change technology on dramatically, and every ship that we keep the design stable ought to cost less than the ship before it. But there are a couple of important things to remember about the bipartisan budget agreement, the most important of which is it only goes through 15. And unless something happens after that, we go back to sequester. After that, we go back to just this way of cutting that makes very, very little sense. When we're planning, when we're budgeting, when we're deciding what the Navy and Marine Corps need to look like in the years ahead, we've got to be willing to look at entirely new ways of doing things. And I've given you a couple of examples: the afloat forward staging base and the joint high-speed vessel. Getting locked into 2 things. One is that's always the way we've done things, or the other is we tried that once and it didn't work. Those are not rationales or excuses. And Navy and Marine Corps have never been big on excuses. And we're not going to begin now. For more than 2 centuries, the Navy and Marine Corps provided the American people with the flexible and the agile force we have needed in our nation's defense. The men and women who join the Navy and Marine Corps have that personality that they want to see what's over the horizon. One foreign head of defense told me, he said, and he wasn't meaning this in a critical way at all, and neither am I. He said that armies look at maps and borders. They look at the ground, as they should. The Navy and the Marine Corps look at the open horizon, at what's next. That same spirit makes naval leaders who look for innovation, new and different solutions, to look what's coming over the horizon instead of what's already passed. And we have to provide them the platforms, the systems, the weapons that they need to innovate, to do that job into the future. Today in Afghanistan, all our forces continue to fight very bravely. Our sailors, our Marines, our soldiers, our airmen, our Coast Guard. But we are beginning to wind down that mission. And our nation is focused, as it ought to be, on bringing people home. But as everybody here knows, there are no permanent homecomings for sailors and Marines. We have been forward deployed for the life of this country ever since Edwin Preble took the Essex around South America into the Pacific in 1800, we have been forward deployed. Day after day, week after week, year after year, sailors and Marines, far away from home, stand the watch at all times, in peace and in war. For over 238 years, our Navy has been the most visible and capable sign of American power around the world. Forward deployed, we remain our country's most responsive, most immediate option to do whatever it is that needs to be done. Even in these difficult and uncertain times, we have to endeavor to keep it so. So from the Navy, Semper Fortis, forever courageous. From the Marines, Semper Fidelis, forever faithful. Thank y'all. I think I've got time for 2 or 3 questions, if anybody has one. Or did I convince everybody?
Sir.
Where am I? Oh, I'm sorry.
Would you consider running for president?
And here I thought you liked me.
Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming and sharing your thoughts and remarks. How goes the battle for our carrier count?
Our carrier count is mandated by law, 11. And so it's sort of like gravity. It's not just a good idea, it's a law. And we're very cognizant of that. And I think, though, that whether you're talking about carriers or anything else, it shows some of the dangers of the non-strategy based, the non-flexible spending cuts, because then everything has to be looked at.
Thanks for your service, Mr. Secretary. Your anecdote about looking at an actual college catalog I can relate to, but it prompted me to ask you the same question I asked Secretary Stackley yesterday, and that is, what are your perspectives on cyber warfare, both offensive and defensive?
Well, cyber is, as you all know, and is very obvious, becoming a more and more crucial part of everything that we do. And we are taking, I think, a lot of positive steps toward making sure that the networks that we have, and so much of our things, like everybody's network today, to making sure that we can defend those, to making sure that in a crisis situation or a conflict, that our systems work and maybe others don't. We're taking some, I think, very visible and very concrete and very good steps in that way. I mean, we're upping the number of people, both in the Navy and the Marine Corps, that deal with cyber. The Marines are coming down in size after they surged to 202,000 from 175,000. But even as they come down in size, they're adding cyber capabilities. We stood up 10th Fleet, which is our cyber capacity. we established a new warfare specialty called information dominance, which includes cyber, includes a lot of things that were scattered out around the fleet. I think that we in the Navy, we in the military understand that, and it's part of what I was talking about, technology doesn't stand still. Warfare doesn't occur the way it did in the past. And if you don't see what's next, you could be in serious trouble. But I do think I think we recognize the threat very clearly on both sides, offense and defense. And I think that the steps we're taking are going to get us to at least what we can see now into a pretty good place. Not that there won't be some risk. And it's just like I said, what you can see now. It's always a race. As you put up one defense or you come up with an offensive capability, other people are moving to meet those. And so it's one of those technologies, as most are, that you never can quit evolving and you never can lose your edge doing it.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your comments. I'll do my best to take your words back to my organization, but an administrative point, sir. There's precious few of us here from my organization. A junior engineer in my command will file his 1040 EZ with less frustration, will be reviewed less times, and will hear back sooner from the IRS than he will receive permission to come to a conference like this. We believe in leadership. We understand we are the stewards of the taxpayers' country. We are the professionals who are on call to support you in the Navy, 24/7, 365. We would like to have that responsibility back at our level to determine how best to educate and network and continue forward this engineering that we do into the next generation, sir.
I understand very well what you're saying. Some of these restrictions, no, I won't say some of them, nearly all of these restrictions came from inappropriate acts by others. And anytime there are those inappropriate acts, there's a reaction. And as you work through it, that's where we are now. And one of those things is taking a close look at every conference. There are some that are very valuable. There are some that just aren't. And we are learning how to differentiate. And we may not be doing that fast enough, and we may not be. Your point that you can hear from the IRS quicker than you can hear whether you can come to a conference. I will take that back to my organization.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.